Welcome to the Catholic New Yorker. If we have not yet met, I'm Mr. Basile, and we're going to take you around Manhattan. We've come in here now during the quarantine where it's a little quieter, but this church would normally be open. We'll do a virtual tour of this church. Catholic history in New York is pretty fascinating. You would think that when the Pilgrims came here in around the 1620s, you would think that shortly after you would see some Catholic influence in the United States. That will really not happen until after the Revolutionary War. One of the things that is pretty amazing as you look at the Dutch history and the English history in New York City especially, there's a great anti-Catholic sentiment. They were, especially once the people were established, there was really an anti-immigrant sentiment, very similar to maybe what might persist today. So we're going to see probably if you want to just to get a little idea of the history in the United States, it will be in the 1640s that the French missionary Isaac Jogues will come to the Americas. He will spend a lot of time upstate. If you've ever gone to Auriesville, maybe if you've gone to Founders Hollow, maybe Brother Kenneth, or maybe Mr. Brennan or some of the other moderators have taken you up to Auriesville, you will see the influence of Isaac Jogues and Kateri as they try to evangelize the Native American people. Isaac Jogues had a pretty amazing experience his first time. He saw there were about 15 different languages upstate, and what he did is he was really welcomed once he arrived in New York with open arms. At that time, there was a great missionary spirit, but it didn't last long. When he came back, Isaac Jogues, unfortunately, what happened to him, he was martyred by the Iroquois. And that was really the first experience of Catholicism here in the United States. It will take until the post-Revolutionary War period, where we'll see here in New York, in 1785, we'll see the first diocese is going to be established. The British and both the Dutch had prohibited Catholic worship. The thing that will assist in the Catholic influence in the New York area will be that at the time when around the Revolutionary War, really you're going to see New York City as one of the capitals of the United States. People from all over are going to come here, and many Catholics will come here. But it will not be until 1785 that you will see St. Peter's being built. On this site was a smaller wooden church. It will be maybe only a few thousand people in the whole New York area would be Catholic. But soon enough, this church overflowed. And little by little, you saw the Catholic influence begin to grow. It really becomes something that especially the Irish come here in small numbers. Probably by the year 1800, there are only a few thousand Irish Catholics here in the United States, in the New York area. Probably only a few hundred French Catholics, maybe only a few hundred German Catholics. And that really is the only influence that we have. Now, St. Peter's is going to be an important part of this, because what it really does, it says now the Catholics have kind of like a stake in the game here in the New York area. There are two people in particular that we want to talk about, and one is Pierre Toussaint. You will see that even if you come down on the corner here of Barclay and Church, you will see that it is Pierre Toussaint Plaza. It is a really very, you'll see his influence. Pierre Toussaint was from Haiti. He was originally in the Americas as a slave. He will be someone who was brought to New York still as a slave. He will continue, really being kind of the property of someone. And he was such an incredible person that even as his own owner at the time, as they fell into financial ruin, Pierre Toussaint learned the trade of being a hairdresser, and Pierre Toussaint used his craft and his influence, because he served as a hairdresser to all these very, very notable people in New York. Pierre Toussaint actually used his influence to support his owner, which would have been really an incredible thing at that time. Pierre Toussaint is going to be given his freedom. He will become a benefactor. He will be a parishioner here for more than 60 years. We will go to Old St. Patrick's Basilica. Pierre Toussaint will also have an influence there. There will be an orphanage and a school attached to Old St. Patrick's. He will support those. He will use his influence and his ability to raise money to help all of these different people around him. Also, another very, very important figure and a parishioner here was Elizabeth Ann Seton. Elizabeth Ann Seton was not born a Catholic. She didn't marry into a Catholic family. What happened, she was a very, very also an influential New Yorker. She married a very rich New Yorker. But unfortunately, with her husband, Mr. Seton not only became sick, but he lost all of his money. Now, because he had some influential friends, because he had people that tried to really take care of him, they sent him to Italy. And while he was in Italy, he was under the care of this Italian family. And Elizabeth Ann Seton, even though her husband soon died, she saw the generosity and the love, the Christian love of this family. And she was so touched and also so influenced by the Eucharist and Catholic devotion that soon she wanted to herself become a Catholic. She will worship here at St. Peter's. We will see the incredible altar. She came here to contemplate her faith and contemplate the resurrection, which is why so many people have come to the importance of Catholicism. And she will end up in the New York area, not only establishing a religious order. Now think of it, as a layperson, think about her influence. She establishes the Sisters of Charity. She is going to establish the first free Catholic schools in the United States. And she will also form several orphanages, not only between New York, but in Baltimore. Now, you would think that for this layperson, it's like, well, what kind of influence can you have? She was a person that came to the Catholic faith, and she loved her Catholic faith. She's going to be someone that saw the importance of taking care of the poor, taking care of those who were less fortunate. And not only Pierre Toussaint, but Elizabeth Ann Seton are going to take their influence, their Catholic influence, and show the rest of the world what it is to show the love of Christ. Now we're going to go inside the church. We will show you some of the highlights of this church. It's one of the most overlooked churches. We are in the shadows of the World Trade Center in the Freedom Tower. This really has become an important area. They have their own 9/11 tribute here at this church. This was really part of the resurgence of New York. St. Peter's served as a place of worship, especially during those very, very difficult times. The importance of the Catholic faith here from 1785 on, we're going to see that the Catholics are going to really be at the heart of New York and New York City. So as we go inside, I'll give you a little virtual tour, and we'll see the importance of really how the Catholic faith is going to start to expand here in New York. If you look at the early history of even New York City, if you look at even the southern tip of Manhattan, beyond the first maybe even mile from the tip of Manhattan going north, anything really above that, even less than that, is almost totally rural. So it will be a gift from King Charles III of Spain, that he will make a gift of, I believe it's about 1,000 silver pieces that will be given to the Catholic Church in New York City. And he's going to give it for the construction of the very first Catholic Church in New York City. But one of the things that is going to happen is that the church is going to want to be, they're going to want to build their church on Broad Street, which is much further south than the current location of Barclay and Church. So when they were building it at that site, actually New York officials asked the church if they would move it further north. Now, this current location of Barclay and Church was actually outside of the city. They did have a lot of support, as we said, from outside the country, especially from Spain and even Mexico. The Mexican artist Jose Vallejo is going to paint this incredible icon of the crucifixion, and it will be given to us from the President of Mexico to the parish in 1789. This will be given to St. Peter's. This first church that is going to be built is really going to be an important part of kind of establishing a little bit of presence. Now, when they build it on Barclay and Church, this is actually outside of the normal city limits. So if you're considering how big New York City was, you can imagine once we go to Old St. Patrick's, that is, as the city starts to grow, that's how many years later that the city is now starting to spread north. So when Archbishop Yu says, I want to build a church that's in the 50s, which is halfway up Manhattan Island, people are going to think that he's lost his mind. And that's why they call that Yu's folly. The important part, there are a couple of different people that we want to really think about when we think about St. Peter's. We mentioned earlier Mother Elizabeth Ann Seton. She is going to have a great conversion. She converts from the Episcopal religion to Catholicism here at St. Peter's. She is going to be. Other notable people will be Billy the Kid, will be baptized at this church. He's another notable person, and his parents were actually married here at St. Peter's as well. It will be in 1806, on Christmas Eve, that the nativists actually stormed the church during Mass, and a huge fight broke out. And this fight between the nativists and the Catholics actually ensued during the Mass, and even one policeman was killed. This was not unusual that we talked about how these riots were breaking out. Baltimore, Philadelphia, they had seen this type of interaction between the Catholics and the Protestants, but really what was going on is that the Protestants really wanted to burn out the Catholics, even one church and one convent at a time. One very, very important early notable priest here was Father William O'Brien. And between, I guess it's 1795 and 1798, there was a massive yellow fever outbreak in New York City. And he was known for really tending to the sick during that epidemic. And he really became known for his compassion. And he even drew people to the church because of his incredible compassion. The first Mass is going to be celebrated down here in 1786, but it will not be until they rebuild the church that you're going to be looking at the current church, which will be 1836. And that's when this church, the cornerstone, is actually going to be laid for the modern St. Peter's. Now, St. Peter's will have a very important role to play during the 9/11 attacks. Father Michael Judge, if you have any sense of the history of that day, he really has been documented as the very first victim. Father Michael Judge was a chaplain for the fire department of New York, and he was someone that the firemen loved. He was someone that was greatly admired, and he died that day on September 11th. And the day before, he had given a beautiful homily to the firemen in the Bronx. And here's what he said. You do what God has called you to do. You get on that rig and you go out and you do the job. No matter how big the call, no matter how small, you have no idea of what God is calling you to do. But God needs you. He needs me. He needs all of us. God needs all of us to keep supporting each other, to be kind to each other, to love each other. But God calls you and calls you to do it indeed. He gives you a love for what you do because it's a difficult job that will be done well. Isn't God wonderful? Isn't He good to you? And to each and every one of you and to me. Turn to God each day. Put your faith, your trust, and your hope and your life in His hands. And He'll take care of you. And you'll have a good life. And this firehouse will be a great blessing to His neighborhood and to this city. Amen. On the next day, Father Michael Judge will perish, as will many other firemen and policemen and first responders that came. The city was changed by that day, but because of the heroism of people like Father Michael Judge and these first responders, it was transformed even for the better. Now, the roof of St. Peter's was damaged that day because the landing gear had actually landed on top of the roof and did some damage. Now you can imagine, you're talking about, even though we're in the shadow of the original Twin Towers, you could see the amount of destruction that happened down here. After Father Michael Judge was taken from the Twin Towers that day, he was laid in front of the altar at St. Peter's. He became the first sacrifice. And the firemen, even in their symbolism, they gave him over to Christ. The story of St. Peter's is one that calls us to understand our faith, even in moments of difficulty. Imagine being in Mass and someone interrupting that Mass because they don't want you there, or they don't want you to worship as you please to worship, as that you're called to worship. So in these times, the people built St. Peter's, and they continued to sustain St. Peter's, and that it even served as a symbol of faith in moments of tragedy during 9/11. The first responders used this church to store their equipment, and the pastor who recalls that story talks about the equipment being 6 foot high on every single pew in that church. A church is an extension of who we are. It's an extension of what we are called to be. And like Father Michael Judge said, go out and do that job and do it well, because it's what God calls you to do. He'll take care of you. He'll take care of you and your family if you have faith. And that's what the story of St. Peter's really shows us.